Good morning, everyone. Good evening, wherever you are, whatever your time zone is. I hope it's a good day. Welcome to Feminists Yearning, Imagining, and Organizing for Just Peace and Genuine Security. And thank you for being with us. Before we begin our program, we acknowledge the lives taken by the corona pandemic, by state violence, by violence rooted in the intersections of misogyny, racism, classism, transphobia, among other forms of oppression. We are in ethical solidarity with the struggle for Black lives, with struggles against colonialism and imperialism everywhere. So we say this is not a moment for silence, as Subha would say, but instead a time to pause, to let this extraordinary moment enter the room. We also want to acknowledge the original people of the land, wherever you are. In California, in the Bay Area, it happens to be the Ohlone people. And in some places, the original people's land was stolen, colonized, and everything of value extracted, including human beings, natural resources, and sacred objects. We invite our ancestors, our spiritual guides, our comrades, friends, and family also to enter, if they're not here already, because we believe they will guide us through our gathering today. They will give us the guidance we need. And of course, we thank the organizers of the 7th South-South Forum on Sustainability, the Global University, and the Global University for Sustainability, and Lingnan University in Hong Kong for hosting us for these 2 days. We're here under the auspices of our organization called Peace Women Across the Globe, and was invited by Professor Lee Kiu Chi, who you see in one of the squares here. Wave, Kiu Chi. She's kind of the brainchild of this whole thing from the first time it happened. And to welcome us officially from our organization, I'd like to invite our founder, co-president, and our other co-president couldn't be here, Kamla Basin from India. But Gabi, if you share with us your words of welcome, that would be a nice kickoff.
So I'm Ruth Gabi Wermer from Switzerland. I'm a former parliamentarian and member of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is the UN of Europe. And I'm the co-president of Peace Women Across the Globe, together with Kamla Basin from India. Peace Women Across the Globe is an international feminist peace organization. The seat is in Switzerland. As a former member of the Council of Europe, I have been visiting refugee camps in various crisis and conflict regions for many years, in Azerbaijan and Armenia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Kosovo, Serbia, and Chechnya, in Israel, Palestine, and in other parts of the world. Everywhere, I met courageous women who did work for peace, often in extremely dangerous surroundings. They managed the difficult task of obtaining food and medicine for those in need. They looked for missing peace persons and struggled to acquire better living conditions for refugees. They did schooling to orphans in order to distract them from their war experience and ghostly memories. They condemned torture, murder, rape, and abductions, and they documented clandestine the war parties' brutalities by taking photos and video footage of brutally tortured corpses. They helped desperate repatriates women, men, and children with advice, action, and care to return into their homes destroyed by the war. This very often despite their fears and anxieties. Women do everything for the landmines to be cleared before their children get mutilated or killed by them. Minds are the gruesome and deceitful weapons against children. The women organized roundtables for peace talks. Women talked together about the murders, the atrocities, and the systematic rapes so that it doesn't get stuck in their souls. It is women who are victims of wars. It is women who weep for the dead. They are the survivors who press for a return to peace, courageously and resolutely, without regard for personal safety. They struggled for peace. My contact with these women in the beginning of the 2000 years, my contact with these women and the awareness that their work leaves scarcely a trace outside their sphere of activities preoccupied me incessantly. I realized that we all must render visible the concrete work for peace done by women. I realized that women's peace work has neither been recognized nor appreciated and celebrated. Thus, the idea 1,000 Women for the Nobel Peace Prize 2005 gradually took form. With 20 coordinators worldwide and a small office in Bern, Switzerland, we nominated 1,000 women for the famous Nobel Peace Prize. The big aim was to make visible the peace work of women. The 1,000 women didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, but in consultation with the coordinators and the international board, and with common goals, we continued to work. The network of the 1,000 women has no ground. Together with our partner organizations and under their leadership, peace tables are being created in many countries. We are guided by UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security and other important conventions that are intended to improve the living conditions of women. We are pleased that the network is growing. We are pleased about the many contacts with extraordinary women worldwide. And this is now our last South-South Forum. After we had also 6 South-South Forum. And Margo, please give me the floor at the end of this last workshop. I would like to thank everybody at the end of the workshop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Gabi's been just an amazing leader for us, and we've learned a lot. And so thank you for, it's going on almost 20 years now, I guess. Anyway, let's begin. So the current moment, Corona pandemic, combined with global uprisings and state responses to both, demands us feminists around the world to stand in solidarity. But to do so, we must take time to think together across regions and other borders in order to understand the current material conditions and the political situations in more nuanced ways, to imagine feminist futures that will be able to secure livelihoods, sustain the natural environment, and ensure the dignity and well-being of all living things, of all living beings. And finally, to organize transnationally as feminists to realize that vision. We recognize that neoliberal capitalism, right-wing ethno-populism and nationalism, religious fundamentalisms, militarism, colonialism, and imperialism form the foundations of the world in which we exist. And I think we see that more now than ever before. Region-specific forms of patriarchy and male dominance, anti-Blackness and other forms of racism, ethnocentrism, class and caste, heterosexist and transphobia, ecological violence, and other intertwined life-destroying forces are manifested through and buttressed by these forces. So our sessions have been organized around the following concepts and questions. The landscape. What is this moment telling us societally about what we should let go and change, and what to hold on to and do differently and better? Yearnings. What one thing is tugging at your heart and spirit, both personally and politically, in this particular moment? Imaginings. If we truly took seriously the answers to the previous questions, what must a feminist future look like? Include and demand. What values and principles would be the foundation of our vision? And the doing. What are feminists doing now that moves us toward realizing that vision? And what else will we need to be doing? So the series, the 6-part series, was designed to cover 5 topics: ecology, access to land, livelihood, and food security; violence against women; colonization, occupation, militarism, and feminist peace work; ethical solidarity and responsibilities of activists in the global north. This last panel is the U.S. racial politics, state violence, and the global implications. These are topics that we thought were life and death for women in particular, but many beings on this planet. So that's how we came to those. Okay, we'll start with our first speaker, who is Ashley Woodard Henderson. Ashley is the first Black woman executive director of the almost 100-year-old organization called the Highlander Research and Education Center, a social justice leadership training school and cultural center founded in 1932. She's also a leader in multiple movement organizations and formations, including the Movement for Black Lives, National Bailout Collective, and Southern Movement Assembly. Ashley is a longtime activist working against environmental racism in Central and Southern Appalachia, and has fought for workers' rights, racial justice, women, LGBTQIA+ rights, reproductive justice, international human rights, and has led intergenerational social movements across the South. Thank you so much, Ash, for being here, and open us up.
All right. No pressure. Well, what's up, comrades? It's so good to see you. It's such a blessing and honor and a privilege to be on with so many people that I love so deeply and I respect, and whose work I stalk, and just who have influenced the organizer and activist and leader that I am today. So I'm so grateful for y'all, and particularly grateful to Margo for your leadership and your vision and the joy that you share with all of us, but also the discipline and rigor. Just so grateful for you. What a time to be alive and to be a person developed by Black feminisms in the United States. It is a season. When I think about the landscape, this moment, and what it's telling us about ourselves as folks, particularly in a United States context, is that white supremacy and anti-Black racism is a global pandemic that is just as deadly as the coronavirus, which is also disproportionately impacting Black people in the United States, particularly Black people in the Southeast of the United States, where the majority of Black people in the country live. So what I know about this moment is that capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and all of the other forms of systemic oppression in the United States are killing us fast and slow. And that there is no way in which we can be liberated unless those systems are not only like reformed for the sake of harm reduction, but dismantled from the bottom up and put away so that they can never exist again. The world that I'm yearning for is one where our people have the right to self-determination, They have sovereignty, they have the ability to self-govern, and they have everything that they need to live long lives in their fullest dignity. And what I feel excited about is that the world that we've been imagining, what was impossible yesterday, is totally possible today. What frustrates me about the landscape is that it required infinite amounts of cumulative Black death to get us to this moment. And when I talk about Black death, I can't not talk about the gendered lens of that. That it's meant literally trans Black women being murdered by the dozens every week. It's meant tens of thousands of Black people dying because of the coronavirus. It's meant like literally every 28 hours in the United States, a Black person, regardless of their gender, is murdered by a police officer, a security guard, or a vigilante every day, once a day at least. And that's just what we can track, right? So that it took this much cumulative Black death bothers me. But what amazes me is that if you had said defund the police, and when we talked about the police, we meant immigration cops, we meant school resource officers, right? Cops and children's schools, we meant every kind of police officer. We were talking about military, we're talking about demilitarizing the police, we're talking about defunding the military. Those things people would have said were impossibilities 2 and 3 months ago. And now people are making those demands. We've seen the announcement from the Movement for Black Lives for federal policy called the Breathe Act, and you can see it at breatheact.org, that's calling for basically the dismantling of the criminal legal system as we know it. And people 3 months ago would have told us that was impossible. Even 2 months before that, 5 months ago, people would have told us the abolition of prisons and getting our folks out of cages was impossible. And what we've seen is that just like that, the state fails, and just like that, the ability to free our people has become even more possible, right? So what I yearn for, what I imagine, is a world where that is the status quo, not the exception to the rules as we know them. And that the things that we are demanding for folks in the US, particularly for Black folks, particularly for Black oppressed gendered folks and marginalized and targeted communities, is actually what we want and demand for all of humanity everywhere across the globe. And that the solutions that we're implementing in these moments have to be good for our people and our planet, right? Those are the things that we are demanding, and that's the world that we yearn for. I think in a time where people have so consistently said that these are just a bunch of young, angry Black people that don't have a vision, I think we have clearly articulated it since 2016. It's called the Vision for Black Lives. It's also synthesized in the Breathe Act. And I feel excited because we are naming what we want and deserve, not just what we can concede to. And I think that is an opportunity for global feminists. Is what would we ask for if we were talking about our utopian vision for women and girls in this world? What would we demand, right? What would we win, right? Because we don't get it if we don't fight for it. And what does it look like to be humanitizing those folks and to make sure that we're following their leadership in practice, not just in principle? That is the world that I yearn for. And I think she's here. I think she's here. I think we're seeing those victories happen. The movement for Black Lives would not exist without Black feminisms. It would not exist without the work that people like Margo have done for so long before us. And so I'm excited about seeing social movements that are rooting feminisms throughout their praxis, not just as a principle on a sheet of paper, and recognizing that there is no front line of struggle, whether it's labor, whether it's reproductive justice, whether it's climate justice, whether it's racial justice, et cetera, that is not rooted. It can't be successful without feminism. And so I'm excited to the fact that most of the social movements that I'm familiar with and participating in the US context are led by folks that are bringing a Black queer feminist praxis to the work. And so I think that's why the world that I believe in that should exist is on its way, is because it's being led by folks that are rooted in a Black feminist praxis. So I think that's the world that I long for. And that's the world that I think so many of us are called to continue to build. So with that, I will stop and toss my time back to Margo. Thank you.
All right. Well, as usual, you've got us going. You've inspired us. So we'll just keep going on. Next, we have Lone. Lone is a queer bilingual writer and educator of color based in Durham, North Carolina. They've worked on issues of migrant justice, LGBTQ liberation, economic and racial justice, and for an end to all interpersonal violence. Thank you, Lone. Welcome, and please start. And please remember to talk slowly because we're working with interpreters.
Yeah, thanks, Margo, and thanks, Ash, for opening us up. And appreciations and lots of gratitude to all of the organizers who have been working very hard over many, many different time zones to bring us together for these really important conversations. And I am really grateful to be able to participate. I am based in the US South. My family is originally from Vietnam. And so when I think about even just the title of this series of gatherings, South-South, there's a lot that comes to mind for me, just in terms of our incredible responsibility and mandate to continue to build international solidarity. And how crucial it is, I think, especially in this moment, when people around the world are experiencing in a really distilled and fundamental way some of the same threats and challenges to our basic humanity. I think a lot of what both in Margo and Ash's framing is very true, right? Like we name capitalism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, colonialism, class and caste systems. And I think all of that language is really wonderful. And I think there are some challenges and limitations too in some of that language, right? And I really appreciated some of the questions that were used to frame these conversations, because I think in a really fundamental way, when we think about the restructuring and reconfiguring of these systems, at the heart of it, it is this, the locomotive and the drive is to prevent human beings from doing the thing that we are sort of just meant to do, which is to change and to relate to each other. To be in this consistent process of becoming. And I believe that it's expressed in very specific ways, right? For Black folks, for migrants, for women and girls, for queer and trans people, there are all of these very specific and generalized ways that the violence of these systems that prevent us from becoming more and more human, with threats of death and war, hunger and poverty, domestic violence, all of those things. And so when I think about this moment, that's what really weighs heavy on my mind, right? Is that these systems are out to strangle what is good about humanity, right? Our ability to change, our ability to connect, our ability to shape our own lives and the lives around us. And so when I think about, this political moment, I think about what would it mean for us to be more honest, both in naming what is actually happening, that I believe many social movements in the US and around the world are doing very well. But how do we also be honest about naming some of the limitations, right? And how do we continue to express the complexities of our lives and of our experiences? And I feel that especially strongly as a Vietnamese migrant who has never organized under the banner of Asian Americans, because I find it to be extremely limiting and monolithic. And I imagine that to be true for most colonized or migrant and refugee people, especially within the US, right? The whole concept of the United States being a prison house of nations is very true. And how do we wrestle with that contradiction in a way that both honors, again, the specific experiences of folks here and around the globe, but also the very generalized ways that all of our lives are being threatened. What would it mean for us to be honest about the nuances and contradictions even within our own communities, that when we're up against these systems, you know, fighting against capitalism and white supremacy, that there is an incredible way that the questions of homophobia and transphobia and misogyny and patriarchy are sidelined, as if we don't believe that our people are capable of wrestling with these contradictions and these complexities. And so how do we use our honesty not to be holier than thou, organizer, smarty pants people, right? But how do we use that to fuel a real deep belief that our people are both capable and deserving of this world that we are fighting and envisioning for? And I think, you know, along with that, I think a lot about solidarity in this moment, and what does solidarity really mean, and how does it just go beyond the words we say or the phrases we have, and how especially can it go beyond what we know to be an extremely US-centric and individualistic way of relating to each other. You know, there is not a script for how we show up for each other. As much as we, you know, maybe sometimes wish that there could be. And, you know, I think capitalism keeps us from doing things with people, and it continues to make us objects that are done upon. And so, you know, why would we not want to strive for a kind of revolutionary work and solidarity that is actually something grounded in what we do with each other? And so those are the questions that I'm posing. Those are the questions that I'm thinking about. And for me, at the end of the day, I think there is also, how do we not be so, or I'll speak for myself, how do I not be so incredibly hard on myself and on our social movements, knowing that these are incredible, you know, just incredibly life-sucking systems that we're up against. And there are folks around the world doing incredible work every single day to keep pushing, to stay the course, to hold steady. And I think that is a crucial piece of this moment that we're in too, is how do we continue to hold steady? Because while I think there are new and specific conditions that this moment has brought up, there are new layers of consciousness that have been developed. We're up against systems that are centuries old. We're up against practices, policies, codes, and laws that have been in existence for a very long time. And so how do we also not fall into the trap, I think this sort of capitalistic and white supremacist trap that things are new all the time, when really it's a maneuvering of these systems to pretend like it's something new, when all of us know very well deep in our experiences and in the realities of our communities that these things are not new. But we can continue to be generative and creative in how we resist and how we shape something different. And so that's what's on my mind, and I'm gonna close it up and I'm gonna hand it back to Margo. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lone. I guess your words and Ash's words speak for themselves. Next, we're going to hear from Xhercis. Xhercis is a popular educator, decolonial feminist philosopher, and founder of the University Transformative Justice Program, a project committed to abolitionist and intersectional approaches to addressing sexual assault and gender-based violence. A Boricua child of factory workers raised in Cleveland by way of New Jersey. Those are interesting places, right? For those of you who know the states. She's a first-generation graduate who uses decolonial pedagogies in her day job as associate professor and vice chair of the Women and Gender Studies and Queer Studies Department at CSU Fullerton to support the next generation of troublemakers. And for those of you who are outside the US and maybe outside California, the California State University system is truly a university system for the people. And so Xhercis being there is definitely a testament to her commitment. So welcome, Xhercis, and please take it away. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much, Margo. I'm actually really grateful to be here despite the hour. So no worries on that end. Yes, it's 6 a.m. here. So, well, 6:30 now. Thank you. I'm so actually grateful to follow up from Ash and Lone because they really set the stage for this conversation. Some of the things that I've been thinking about a lot as we think about the global pandemic, we think about the uprisings. Some of the things that have been coming up for me is the use of safety as the primary logic through which violence is enacted, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about how in the name of safety, right, so much of this violence is happening. And that's particularly important to consider if we're thinking about folks who are most vulnerable. I'm also thinking about the ways in which fear will deliver us into the arms of the militarized state in so many ways, right? So I was just watching this ad that, 45 has put out about defunding the police. And if y'all saw it, if you haven't seen it, it's an interesting ad where folks 911, which is where we call for the police, and no one's picking up the phone. And then it juxtaposes all of these people rioting, fires, all this thing. And it's designed to get you to, and it actually starts with rape, right? So it uses this idea that like, if we don't have the police in place, we're not going to have these protections and these safeties. And what's intriguing to me is that when I think about sexual assault in particular, police don't stop that from happening, right? So that's just one example where there's this false logic in the name of safety. So I've been thinking about that. I think this is an incredible moment for us to reimagine what it means for us to be safe and the kind of work that we have to do in our communities and with each other for that to be the case. I really appreciate the fact that it was something that couldn't have been imagined a few months ago for those of us who have been thinking about alternatives to the criminal justice system, and to see the acceleration and the shift in this kind of tipping moment is an important moment for us to also, with that, think about what we're going to build out to ensure that we're both safe from these systems, but also safe within our communities. And I think those are the things that I've been thinking about a lot, because it's a both and, in the sense that it's easy for us. Well, it's easier for me to imagine that external person assaulting me, right? Or coming at and creating so much violence in our various communities. But I also think about what kind of work needs to happen so that these movements aren't necessarily on the backs of those folks who are most marginalized, even within our communities. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about is the economic crisis that's here already, and the ways in which the state, in its effort to derail us away from this uprising, is also creating other insecurities, right? So I'm thinking specifically about the mass evictions. I'm thinking about this new movement where because I'm a professor, we have this new policy that international students, if we remain online, have to leave, right? So getting everybody to fight for their own survival, I think, as a way of derailing us
from this incredible uprising, which is centered on Black lives, right? So being attentive to those kinds of derailing plays. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. I think it's, when I think about the things I'm yearning for, I'm really excited about the amount of creativity that we need, that people have had in terms of organizing. I'm also really excited about thinking with folks about alternatives, or what another way of dealing with harm, intergenerational harm, crisis we're going to build. I recognize that in this moment, folks are creating it's not that folks do not have any models. I think there are models out there. I'm a little bit concerned that people are mapping expectations onto this moment that that they don't map onto the system that we currently have. So folks are expecting things from organizers who are doing all of this work primarily unresourced to somehow do more than what this major resourced militarized machinery has offered us. And so I want to lead and think about this moment with a lot of grace and kindness and humility to say, let's try a bunch of stuff. Let's just keep trying things as we move forward. And it's okay if it doesn't work, because it's all unresourced. Like, right? We have to be generous and give ourselves some space in that. In terms of what I see as incredible, there's a lot of doing right now. And some of the things that I'm most moved by are the mutual aid projects that are coming out. All of the facilitators who are skilling up so that they're able to deal with harm inside of their communities, and the amount of sharing of information that's happening right now, internationally, but I mean locally, but also I think so those are some of the things I've been thinking about. And I'm gonna actually end it with a question that from this little piece that I wrote that sits with me. I was thinking about what it means to belong in this moment outside of a nation state model. How much work do we have to think of, like what kinds of things do we have to think about in that possibility? And I was also thinking about my mom, who's a survivor of domestic violence. And I wrote, perhaps the most important lesson was that in the face of personal crises, even as my mother dreamed of stability and safety, she was called to practice improvisation and adaptability. Nena, fix your face. We got to keep it moving. So let's keep it moving. What forms of radical love and vulnerabilities must I embrace in order to activate new modes of belonging, safety, and support? How do we cultivate intentional rhizomes of belonging that include care for survivors of systemic and intergenerational harm, care for those of us on the edges that include freedom from assault, mobility unrestricted by militarized police, the abolition of prisons, and the cultivation of joy, healing, and support, even in times of crisis? So with that, I'll hand it over.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want everybody who's here to know that I've learned a lesson from each of the people who are on this panel, and more than one. And so I hope you're having the same experience as we just listened to the three of our four folks. Before we move to you, Subha, there's just a question that came up, and this is not for answering, but just for us to think about. And the question comes from Javiera Rosa, And the question is it possible for white supremacy transforms into other faces? Is it possible for white supremacy to transform into other faces? Can it take other shapes? So we'll just leave that for now. And Subha, thank you for coming all the way from Sri Lanka. Subha is a feminist activist, writer, and researcher, lives in Colombo at present. She has spent more than a decade blogging and writing about Sri Lankan politics and gender, sexuality, and the digital domain. Locally and regionally, she is involved in movements for queer rights and digital rights. At CREA, a global feminist human rights organization led by feminists in the Global South, she develops a global institute on sexuality, technology, and rights, and supports international advocacy and communications. Welcome, Subha. Take it away.
Thank you, Margo. And I also just want to begin, like the others did, by just kind of noting my deep, deep gratitude. It is just a profound honor to be here with all of you. And I think, again, everyone said this, but I have to say it, Margo, you're just such an incredible guide and leader. And I think, I'm just going to echo everyone's gratitude for you for bringing us together, which you are very good at. And it's an incredible, sort of contribution that you make in the world, bringing people together. So I kind of took my homework a little bit too seriously. I went ahead and I kind of just did a couple of slides, like a few slides. I don't know if we can have them. Yeah, I mean, I just put the slides together just because I thought there may be some, there may be some language or some words that maybe folks aren't too familiar with. So it's kind of good to see them as well. And also there are just some images that I want y'all to see for yourselves. I think that'll kind of help. So what I did was I kind of used the questions, which were kind of these guiding questions. And I tried to bring this perspective from South Asia. And I'm kind of going to try and tell you a little bit about how the movement for Black Lives, particularly the sort of the most recent series of protests and uprisings have sort of affected and created conversation in Sri Lanka and in South Asia. So we can go to the first slide. The first thing I'd like to do is actually bring, one of my ancestors and as a result, all of our ancestors into the room. And he was Sivanandan, Ambalavana Sivanandan, who died a couple of years ago. But he was Sri Lankan at the time, Ceylon born, Tamil, who left Ceylon when he was very young and went to Notting Hill, right into the race riots of Notting Hill. And I mean, he became a very iconic academic and thinker and activist, became really, really embedded in the Black sort of activism movements for Black lives in the UK. And I think I learned a lot sort of about really kind of a beautiful and essential sort of solidarity from him. So I'd just like to read something from this interview that was done with him some years ago. So he says, but then in 1958, the riots broke out between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. My father's house was attacked and I had to go disguised as a cop with an empty rifle in my hand to get my parents away from a screaming mob. I saw people being killed just by the virtue of the fact that they were Tamil, people being burnt alive. Meanwhile, the Sinhala Buddhist government, devoted to non-violence, did nothing. Educated people in high places did nothing. The press and the radio did nothing. Sinhalese Tamil friendship ceased at the midnight hour. The whole decadence and degradation of our people stank in my nostrils. I couldn't take it anymore. I just wanted to get away from my country. So I chucked in my job, sold whatever belongings I had, and just pushed off to England. and I came and lived in Bayswater and walked straight into the riots in Notting Hill. That was, I suppose, a double baptism of fire. Sinhalese Tamil riots there, white, black riots here. And I knew then that I was Black. I could no longer stand on the sidelines. Race was a problem that affected me directly. I had no excuse to go into banking or anything else that I was fitted up to do. Yes, fitted up. I had to find a way of making some sort of contribution to the improvement of society, to bring about a society where human beings could be human. So I just wanted to begin with that because I kind of think it really makes me reflect on the question of identity. I mean, this was him, you know, about a decade ago, I think, speaking about maybe a decade and a half ago. And I kind of am just going to leave the question about the way in which he says, I knew then I was Black. And there was no question about it, right? There was no question about the rest of his, sort of the entirety of his life that was dedicated to the struggle for Black lives and to the struggles for, you know, for the working classes and so on and so forth. Can we move to the next slide, please? So a lot of the conversation in Sri Lanka and in other parts of South Asia, when the murder of George Floyd happened and when the ensuing protests were happening, you know, we saw a lot of this, what does it matter to us, right? And I really kept kind of thinking about who is this us? What is this us, right? And I really want to again bring again this question of right now, for example, like someone else said as well, we're in a South-South forum, right? And I think that feminists have been very clear over time, over many decades, that Black women, brown women in North America and in parts of the US, that, you know, that we consider them to be part of the third world, that we consider them to be us, right? That we consider them to be our people. So I kind of came back to this question of like, you're my people, all of who is to say that you're not my people just because of this kind of arbitrary border of the nation state? Can we move, please? Right, so then really the debate was around colorism. And I don't know if folks know, but there's this whole kind of huge history of this product called Fair and Lovely. I don't know if other folks know this, but it's a really huge thing in South Asia, and I believe in parts of Africa as well. So Unilever sells this product. It's called Fair and Lovely. It's been around for about 30 or so years. It's really not a new product. But naturally, given the protests that were happening in the United States and in other places, the debate about colorism, which has been around for a while, obviously, it's not new, but it kind of came back up. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Slide, please. And just so you know, it's not just for women. And this is, by the way, sort of India's biggest Bollywood star, Shah Rukh Khan. So, and it's true for the women actors as well. Like there's a number of really A-list Bollywood actors who sell Fair and Lovely. And this is Shah Rukh Khan on this product called Fair and Handsome. No joke, like that is actually what it's called. And it's a huge thing. Like this is just an incredibly big scene. I do also want to say though that it has always been very clearly marketed to rural and semi-urban communities. That has always been the market for this product. And that's always been kind of the way in which it's been sort of produced and sold in our part of the world. Slide, please. Right, so in response to this Fair and Lovely thing, some years ago, obviously women who were darker skinned began various kinds of social media campaigns. There was one, Dark is Beautiful. There was this other hashtag, Unfair and Lovely, and so on and so forth. Slide, please. Yeah, so this is Nandita Das. I don't know if folks know her. She's also quite well known, quite famous. She kind of was shot to popularity in this film called Fire in the 90s. So that's her. And then she was sort of a big advocate of this Unfair and Lovely and Dark is Beautiful campaign. Slide, please. Yeah, so this is just some stuff from Sri Lanka. These are Sri Lankan born sisters. I believe they're American, and they started this whole kind of thing on Instagram, sharing pictures of themselves with this hashtag Unfair and Lovely. Slide, please. And these are more recent images. So this is the kind of stuff that was happening actually around this time, around the last month or so. So these are kind of, these are quite well-known models. They're in the modeling industry. And a slide, please. The upper left image was in the local Cosmopolitan, and the lower right image is again this model that I said to you was kind of now quite a big face of this conversation. Slide, please. So, okay, so the thing is now, this was the conversation that was happening, and I'll leave kind of the question to you, but obviously there was a big kind of effort to say that colorism is to do with our colonial experience, and that it's to do with white supremacy. And I really, first of all, want to reject that, because that is just, it's just not true. And I think, again, it kind of gives us this real, really kind of, you know, it gives us this way to sort of sidestep our own complicity in kind of oppression and in kind of hegemonic structures. So definitely in our part of the world, colorism, of course, may have been sort of buttressed by our colonial experience and white supremacy, but it's certainly pre-colonial. I mean, it's 100% actually rooted in caste ideology, and that is actually where colorism comes from. It is absolutely to do with these ideas of sort of purity, impurity, and untouchability. And that is to do with feudalism and caste hierarchy. It is this really base idea that people who are dark-skinned are untouchable and are of the lower castes, or actually outside the caste structure altogether, like Dalits. It is absolutely to do with our assumptions about poverty, about the working classes, about laborers who would work the land, you know, in feudal times, and so on and so forth. And of course, to date, as you know, some of our speakers have already said, to date, there is obviously the question of criminality. And it is also absolutely true that the assumption of criminality is like very much more categorically on people who are poor, who are working class, and invariably dark-skinned. And that is, you know, that it has to be said. Slide, please. So some of my issues with this, the dark is beautiful and et cetera and so on, is that, you know, I think it was a really nice kind of feel-good campaign for liberal elite women. And I think there were many kinds of issues and questions in relation to the question of colorism in our part of the world, and how caste operates and how poverty operates, and all of the assumptions around poverty and homelessness and so on, that this kind of really feel-good thing just did not really touch on at all. Also for me, I think the Dark is Beautiful campaign just really did not touch any kind of question about other kinds of non-normative bodies, right? It wasn't really advocating for bodies with disabilities. It wasn't really advocating for bodies that are gender non-conforming, or intersex bodies, or fat bodies, or any of these other kinds of bodies, which is why I wanted you to see those images. At the end of the day, yes, we're saying yes to dark skin, but we're fundamentally saying yes to thin, beautiful, elite, dark women, cis women. So I mean, I think that was, you know, it was kind of interesting. And for me also, it was really interesting that somehow the debate about colorism was now cropping up again in our part of the world, when there was, you know, these mass scale protests happening about the murder of Black people at the hands of the state, you know, in the United States. When we're literally talking about the fact that people are dying because they're Black. So I was also a little bit concerned about this kind of equation, you know, and like I thought that was also kind of interesting. Certainly there is anti-Blackness in South Asia. It is absolutely true that there is. I mean, I myself lived in Bangalore. Sorry, Margo, yes. I myself lived in Bangalore, which is a city in the south of India for many years. And just in the time that I lived there, Bangalore has a really large African student community. Students come from Uganda, Nigeria, and so forth. Just in the time that I was there, there were two separate kind of weeks of incidents where Black students, African students were being dragged out of their lodgings, out of their residences, cars were being set on fire, landlords were chucking students out onto the streets. So I mean, this kind of anti-Blackness is very real, right? It's not that we don't practice it, we do, and it's a very real kind of problem. In Sri Lanka, we don't interact with people of African descent in any sort of meaningful way. So we don't actually have an opportunity to really practice anti-Blackness, but the kind of, the ideas are certainly in many of our people. But what I did find problematic was that in the kind of midst of the conversation about colorism, there was this kind of weird equation being drawn between racism in the United States, which gets people killed, and colorism, which was kind of being advocated by the fashion publishing industry and the modeling industry, which is fine, but it's not that we don't have our own forms of systemic oppression that get people killed, right? And that for me was this very clear line of saying, yes, colorism is a problem, it kind of affects you, people have prejudice against it, it affects who you can marry and so on. But it doesn't really get you killed in our part of the world. Being Muslim gets you killed in our part of the world at present. Being Dalit, being untouchable gets you killed in our part of the world, right? So why aren't we actually talking about the systemic racism and the systemic kind of caste ideology that is harmful and the Islamophobia that is actually getting people killed? Slide, please. So this was the other thing that we weren't really talking about. The fact that obviously we have a huge history of police and state violence. So this is just one image from, the recent, the Frontline Socialist Party of Sri Lanka tried to stage a protest in solidarity with the protests that were happening in the US. And the police kind of really violently assaulted the protesters, claiming that they were violating COVID regulations. As you can see in the protest, actually everyone is masked, they're all distancing and all of that. Whereas actually when people were arrested, assaulted by the police and arrested, they were packed like sardines into these trucks where obviously we were like body on body. So it was a bit like, well, obviously this is not about COVID regulation. So why don't you just go ahead and tell us what it's really about, right? So this government, the current government, obviously has a huge problem with dissent. They have a long history of crushing dissent. And this was kind of a very good example of that. But, just to be clear, this was not the first time that we've seen absolutely kind of appalling state violence against protesters in this country. Slide, please. This is from 2013, when the government then, which is the government that's in power right now, deployed the military on protesters in the special economic zones here, which are called free trade zones. So this was basically about water contamination. This is people protesting for their right to access clean drinking water. These are workers in the free trade zones here. And the government deployed the military on them, and the military opened fire, and 3 people were actually killed in this protest in 2013, and many others injured. Slide, please. So these are kind of my yearnings in some sense. So for us, it was more like, can we see the struggle for Black lives as our struggle? And can we transcend the nation state borders and this kind of tribalism and nativism that seems to really limit us? And then for in terms of the transnational piece, it was really like, can we get more Americans to denounce the military and the police state and to denounce US military imperialism in the third world once and for all? And I mean, that is the seed that I saw when there was this threat of the military being deployed on protesters in the US. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is kind of an incredible moment. Like, will more people just openly and publicly denounce the role of the military in imperialism in the third world? And can we all kind of stand together and take that position and say, like, no, we are done. We're done with the military state. We're done with the police state. Defund the whole machine and end imperialism and end violent imperialism in the third world. I think that's kind of it from me at the moment, but I'm sure we'll keep talking and thinking. Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of our speakers. You've just done a fabulous job of framing the issues that we're here to talk about. And also, Subha, thank you for connecting the so-called here and there, which is one of the goals of these 6 sessions. And I thought I would like, before we start asking questions, I invite those of you who are in the audience, as it were, to just reflect for a moment and really think about what you heard. You know, what did you hear each of our speakers saying to us? And what did their comments, their ideas, their challenges evoke in you about your own situation in this moment? And by your, I mean your collective, who you identify as your people, your community. In other words, what's the relevance of what our 5 folks or 4 people have said in your lives right now, in this political moment? So if you would just kind of reflect on that before we start the questions, that would be great. And include there, you know, what you're confused about, what you don't understand, and what you're completely clueless about. Because we all have some kind of cluelessness, right? Where we have no way to even attach to something that we don't know. So I invite you to do that kind of reflection right now. And before we go on, it's just kind of starting from, you know, Ash's saying it's a great time to be alive. I also very much subscribe to that, especially in the form that that I embody. I also want to kind of, you know, pull out, Lone, what you said about, you know, how do we fuel honest conversations among ourselves, right? And Xhercis' point about we over-expect from our leaders. We're so hard. And, you know, I think part of that, of course, has to do with high expectations because we have deep yearnings and we want our leaders, right, to deliver for us. And so that raises the question of what does feminist leadership mean in this moment, both in terms of values and practices. And then Subha, your call for us in the US to dismantle the US military apparatus, right, is so compelling. And so I think those are perhaps the points of departure. And I'd like to give the speakers a chance to ask each other questions, right? And then we'll open up for questions from the other folks. And this is a design that we thought would be really interesting, instead of just speaker to audience, speaker to speaker, right? So some kind of horizontal exchange here before we go out. And anyone can start, and feel free to mute yourselves and ask your question, right? After hearing each other, what are you curious about?
I mean, I think it's a question to all of you, but I'm just gonna riff off something that Ash said right at the beginning when you spoke about sovereignty. And I just think that's just such a good, it's such a good kind of concept and a good idea and a good sort of organizing principle that I think we can kind of very much rely on and keep coming back to. And I was really thinking about you know, the idea of like, what does sovereignty mean to us right now here in this place, for example, where, and I know it's true of many places, where, you know, really the point is that we're just in such a state of corporate capture and military capture, and it's that kind of nexus, right, between the military and the state and corporations, and the state is not even really like the state anymore. And really so much land has just been taken from people, just for development, for all of these kinds of corporate interests, for military interests, for expanding military camps and all of this. And, you know, I'm just really thinking about if you could just reflect or kind of throw out ideas about what does sovereignty mean in the state when people just do not have the ability to access our own land or to kind of have sovereignty over our own land and its gifts. I don't like to use the word resources. I think gifts kind of does a better job, but yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear what any of you or all of you have to say about that or think about that in your context.
I love this question. I feel like it's something that I think about often, both as, you know, a person and a body from a lineage of people that were stolen from their home place, and in a place now where we are, you know, sort of forcibly colonizing other people's lands. And then if we go home, we're also essentially colonizing a place that we haven't lived for centuries. So, you know, I think Black people in an American, like a US and North American context are all, you know, landless people in some ways, even though the economy of the United States is literally built, like there would be no United States had it not been for the forced, you know, labor of African descended people in this country. I think like a lot of what we're learning about in regards to sovereignty comes from, you know, indigenous communities in Turtle Island who have been, you know, can literally be in the US and not be recognized, but could go to France, right, and immediately be seen as sovereign people that have a self-determined government that's for them and by them, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in a Black Southern context, like a Black US South context, and particularly as someone from the Appalachian Mountain Range, where there's been so many extractive industries, whether it was coal mining or tourism, which is another extractive industry, right, et cetera, where folks have been like, who actually are the stewards of this place? Right. When I think about sovereignty, I think about belonging, right? Like I think some people think about it only in the context of the nation state, but I actually think about sovereignty as community building and recognizing community, right? And when I think about what it means to be a Black Southerner, when I think about what it means to be a Black Appalachian, and I think this is true for other, you know, targeted and marginalized communities within the US South context, is that it actually means something to be from this place, in this place, of this place, and these people, regardless of who owns it, right? So let me be more clear, try to break it down. It's like when I think about what it means to be Ashley, I can't think about that outside of the context of the people and the place that actually shared its gifts with me to become who I am right now. And when I think about what sovereignty means, it means it's my responsibility to do everything in my power to make sure that the folks and the place are taken care of as much as they've taken care of me. And that when we do that, we're actually, when we recognize other people's ability to do that, we're actually practicing sovereignty, right? And I think we can do that within and without a nation state. That's totally possible. I think the challenge in this time, particularly in a US context, is how to practice it to scale. Right? How to practice liberation to scale, how to practice freedom and justice for all to scale. We see it. The only time democracy has existed in the United States is when marginalized people have made it so. And so I think the question again actually bumps up against the last question that you asked around like, are we actually gonna get rid of the military or not? Right? Is it actually gonna happen? And to be honest with you, I think there's more work to be done. I think that the policy platform, the vision for Black lives that came from the movement for Black lives was very, very clear on our position about not wanting militarized cops or militarized forces that were harming any other community anywhere else in the whole entire world, right? We're not trying to build things that we're ultimately going to have to tear down. And simultaneously, what's true is that they are so much more heavily resourced than we are. And I think that was something that woke people up for the first time in a long time. 2014, the rebellions after Mike Brown was murdered, they had tanks in the streets in Ferguson, right? They were literally shooting live ammo at people. And I don't think the US had the same sort of response as they've had when the protests that now are in 50 states and 18 different countries. And they're seeing their kids out on the streets during a global pandemic with National Guard resources being put out. And it still hasn't sort of generated the sort of international anti-war efforts that I think we would desire as social movement leaders in this moment. But I do think that what is possible is that people are making more connections than they were before. And I think it goes back to what was said by other speakers, is that this is the moment where I think the political education around connecting those dots and helping them literally see it is an opportunity for us that we haven't had in my lifetime. So, what do I think that sovereignty outside the nation state is possible? Absolutely. I think folks are practicing it already. And do I think that there's the ability to build, revolutionary fervor and resistance around ending the military altogether? Absolutely. I think the last thing that I would say on it is that when we announced the Breathe Act, it's only been about a week in which we've told people that the Movement for Black Lives is presenting federal policy. And it does include like demilitarization of police. It does include cutting military budgets, right? And it's very much connected to the Vision for Black Lives, where we said like the military is killing Black people all over the world. So they're the same as the police that are brutalizing us in our communities. It's just a synthesis of that work. And it's hard, even if you say the sky is blue, to get Americans, folks in the US to agree on anything online, right? Like it's an impossible thing. If you get like 40% of people agreeing on something online, it's kind of miraculous. What we saw in the first day that we announced the Breathe Act is that 90% of the folks that were talking about it in the chatter online were talking in the affirmative. So again, I think that like our ability to get people to be aligned with the demand around demilitarization here, there, and everywhere, I think is really, really live and possible right now. I think the challenge is that alignment is wide, it's not deep. And so, and Alicia Garza talks about that all the time. I think there's a very intentional way that this is sexy right now, but I think there's more to be done to make sure that it's actually deep and that folks are making commitments to changing their behaviors that are actually consenting to that. Because I think a lot of people believe that they're able to be neutral in these moments. And I think we're finding that neutrality is a myth and that's what will get folks to doing deeper engagement.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. And just throwing in here that many people in the US suffer from a McDonald's mentality, right? Which is that things are going to happen very quickly. You drive up, get your burger, eat it in the car, and you're full. Right? So please, Xhercis.
Yeah, I actually love this question as well. I think about it from my positionality as, I'm Puerto Rican. Puerto Rico is a commonwealth. It is not a, it has this very ambiguous, it's a colony, right? And then in that colonial position, folks come to the mainland, are, part of the settler colonial frame of this particular land. And so for me, the thing that comes up around sovereignty is, on the one hand, thinking about what it would mean to actually exactly enact a mode of belonging outside of the nation state, exactly what Ash was saying. It also, for me, means thinking about incommensurability and how these economic systems position us where our personal liberation can sometimes be at the expense of other people's liberations, right? So for me, I think one of the things that I would like to put on here is this question about And I think that the thing that you're saying about asking for a defunding of military globally is exactly that, that we can't just focus on our personal liberation, that we have to be in this practice of thinking about how sometimes we've been set up to imagine liberations that are about crushing other people, right? And that's the colonial project. We see it all over the place where there's an incommensurability of things. And we see it how folks, particularly when we think about South-South dialogues, right? These economic projects, these free trade zones that get set up all over Latin America, all over the Caribbean, right? This constant extraction of resources, of gifts, position people where they have to move, right? They have to move. They end up they move to the, say for instance, or even hurricanes in our case, where folks are mass moving from places to come to this space. And, you know, as a Puerto Rican, it's interesting to me, we're one of the only Latin American spaces that can come to the mainland without needing papers, right? We are citizens, whether we're born on the island or on the mainland, but positions us where, say, the seeking of rights within a settler nation state becomes the liberation project. And that's a fundamental incommensurability. Like, so thinking about those things, and I really appreciate folks who have named sovereignty or autonomy, say like in terms of the Zapatistas, where part of that sovereignty and autonomy is about a freedom from violence, to say the state cannot come here and we are entitled to have well-being. We are entitled to be safe from state harm, right? And that's part of a naming. And I think one of the things that colonization has done is extracting the gifts of labor, right, forcibly. And so being able to name sovereignty as the right to my own body, I think is also part of that formation that has to be part of the conversation. And it's way beyond the nation state.
Yeah, I think it's important to say, like, I live in the US South where lots of people join the military. And they're joining the US military, and I mean, people in my family, right? And they're joining the US military not because they like want to be imperialist, right? They're joining the military for one or both reasons. One is that they don't have economic opportunity where they are. So it's the good job, right? That you're going to have for the rest of your life. And two, because recruiters lie, right? Like recruiters lie. They're like, you're never going to do a bad thing. You're just going to get to go and like hang out on beaches and other places. It's so great. You're going to get to wear this sexy uniform. You'll get to be behind a computer all day. You'll never harm a soul, right? And then they come back different people than when they left, right? And so I want to shout out organizations like About Face and Veterans for Peace and all the incredible organizations in the US that are trying to build an anti-war social movement that keeps our people from being bamboozled by the military-industrial complex that does not give two shits about them, but will take them and their bodies and chew them up and spit them out for the sake of protecting somebody else's profit, right? I think part of the goal, like it won't matter if people that never join the military are the only ones that are talking about how messed up the military is in the US. It's not going to work. We've tried that for decades. I think that the goal is to make sure that folks that are actually directly impacted by those systems are connected with each other, and shouting out the harm that it creates so that people can visualize it. Because I think a lot of people in the US aren't just like cookie cutter, like individualistic, we want it now kind of people. I think part of the challenge is that people are like, yo, like my understanding of the military is that we stopped bad things from happening. Mm-hmm. It was like a savior complex, right? And so I think there's work to be done around that. And I also want to push a little bit about the McDonald's mentality, because I do think that's true. I think that's true wherever capitalism is. Mm-hmm. But I think the bigger thing to me is like, I think that I hear Nina Simone in my head singing too slow, too slow, too slow, right? Because what's real is when, especially for targeted and marginalized communities, when your folks have been fighting for centuries, for generations, demanding the same shit. We've been demanding defunding the police since the first slave catcher went on patrol to come bring us back to Master's Plantation, right? When we've been asking for living wages for all people for generations, when we've been calling for abolition of the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, and capitalism for as long as we've existed, it feels difficult to then be like, well, why not now? Why can't it happen now? And I think that particularly post-COVID-19, when we saw how easy it was for the state to fail, which we had been saying the state was a failure from jump, it doesn't serve our people. When we'd been saying capitalism was in crisis and then the economy tanked, right? And how quick and easy it was with the flick of a pen for white men in power to say, okay, we're gonna let these people that, you know, have done nonviolent crimes out of jails. And we were like, well, we've been asking for that for decades, right? When with a flick of a pen, they could give amnesty to their friends, but not to Assata Shakur or Mumia or like our political prisoners. So I think there's like a yes and to the sort of rapid desire for change that people have and the expectation that that can happen overnight. I think that's ahistoric. And I think that the state intentionally keeps us that way. But on the flip side, I also just want to make sure that people are clear that some of these struggles are actually generations in the making. And so some of the push for immediacy is around frustration that we haven't been able to overcome yet. I think there's a both and there.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just, Xhercis, when you talked about Puerto Rico, in our conversation last night about colonization, we talked about Guahan, right, which is in very similar status to the US as Puerto Rico is. And one of the speakers is Seema Samar, who is here with us today, who is an Afghan feminist. And, you know, they made the connection that, you know, Guamanian members of the US military who joined, because that's the option they have, right, when the whole island is dominated by the military, going to Afghanistan and fighting, right? And so literally we had that connection in that session, and I'm glad that we're making this connection again today.
I'm thinking a lot about how in 1965, Kwame Nkrumah wrote Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, right? And before that, there was text about imperialism being the final stage of capitalism. And so then you have to start wondering, like, what stage is it, right? Like, where are we? And I think, you know, so I think this is a really juicy conversation in that regard, just in terms of what's the level of study and conversation and political education we have to have in order to, you know, be proper stewards of this moment that we're in, right? Because I think that there is a lot of history for us to lean on. And for me, you know, being trained as an organizer in the US South, primarily by Black labor organizers, there's been an articulation for a very long time, for example, from Black Workers for Justice, around stopping the war on Black America, right? Which is a very clear articulation of what's happening inside the US, imperialism, right, against Black folks. It is an attack on colonized people, and it's a recognition of this global system of domination. And so how do we make sure that we don't let that history die, even though social movements ebb and flow, right? When we think about the sort of the upswell of the anti-war movement in 2003, 2004, I mean, it was hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in the United States, you know, regular people being led by more left pole forces, but we're, you know, flooding the streets to say, you know, don't go to war, right? We can't do this anymore. And what does it mean that in the past 16 years, I think in the US, particularly the anti-war movement and the labor movement separately and combined have become really weak. and not for lack of trying, I think from organizers within the US, but from the incredible, I think evolution and sophistication of US militarism, right, and the US empire. When we think now about what US soldiers could do in the 50s and 60s at the height of the Vietnam War, there was a level of rank and file where those soldiers could literally be like, you know what, my commander is my boss. I don't want to be here. There are Vietnamese people in Vietnam from the National Liberation Front telling Black soldiers, like, go home, y'all, we don't want to do this, right? There are Black folks in the US who are like, end the war in Vietnam. What were the conditions that made that possible? And I think part of it is about the, both the ideas, but the mechanics of the US military, right? Of the US empire. Now we have, yes, there are plenty of people who join the military and probably will in a room for a very long time pressing buttons that deploy drones in other places in the world. And so there's that deep level of alienation. And I'm not saying that soldiers need to be humanized within a military context, right? I'm saying that humans need to be humanized, period. But I think the challenge is, I think in a very fundamental way to the question of self-determination, sovereignty, the arenas through which our people are able to wrestle with these questions, these very complicated questions, are fundamentally broken arenas, right? There's no space to really wrestle with the question of harm and violence when the arena for doing so is one where any expression of disdain towards the harm and violence we experience then becomes criminalized, right? Or then becomes a death sentence. And so I think it's I think particularly within the US, and this is, the question that I want to put back out too, is like, how do we make sense of being, I think, someone who is in North Carolina in the US South, I struggle often with what it means to be in the belly of the beast, as some of us like to call it, and to experience what I believe to be some of the relative luxuries of organizing from inside of the empire. I think there is a level, I think increasingly it's becoming threatened. But for many of us, my reality is that I could, for the most part, print out some that say Black Lives Matter or we need a living wage or housing for all, go down to the bus station and talk to regular working people and have these conversations. I can still do that, right? And that's with full recognition that a number of us, including a number of us on these calls, have gotten visits from the FBI, from the police to question our activities, are under an incredible amount of surveillance on a regular basis. But the general climate, for the most part, is that, we can still have these conversations. And so what's it mean for us to take that really seriously, knowing that even within the US, that luxury is also relative, right? And I think that's the conundrum that we're in, is that I think oftentimes in a global conversation, I think, and so this might sound US-centric. I'm not trying to have it sound US-centric, but I think there's a smoke and mirrors that imperialism sets up to make it seem like in the US, we're not aware of these questions. I think in some very fundamental ways we are, but it's sort of, I think it's a little crazy making too, which is the other part of my sort of own obsession around how do we have more honest conversations about this? Because the issue is, I don't think is about recreating any sort of antagonistic dichotomy, right? Folks inside the belly's beast and outside of it, but how do we actually through that veil there that's been created?
Okay, thanks. Xhercis, over to you.
So I wanted to go back to something that Ash was saying about the way the military gets particular investments based on where folks are. And, you know, I was thinking, my father used to tell me this story that when he was in Puerto Rico, that when he had earned a scholarship, and what they gave him for the scholarship was military gear, right? So like, I was like, you didn't get money, you didn't get education. No, he got full military gear. And he was like, it's interesting, like how early these investments come in. And when I think about the prison industrial complex, when I think about the military industrial complex, it's not just the people who are in the military themselves who are invested in it, but it's this, all these pieces of people who are invested in the ideas for it, the economies of it. It's a huge economic system. So like if we think of a prison, right? All the construction workers who build the prison are getting paid, right? It's not an accident that they set up in rural spaces where there's very little economic opportunities, right? And the same thing goes with the military, recruiting folks who are on that edge, who's because of the way racism operates within capitalism, their options are very limited for having a livelihood, right? So it captures that part of things. And one of the things that comes up for me when we think about what would our investments be in demilitarizing, two things come to mind, or one concern and another thing comes to mind. One thing is that when folks are sent elsewhere to enact violence, the idea that that violence remains in that other place is a myth. Folks come back, like Ash was saying, like harmed, and we have to do the work to, and those of us in marginalized communities who have a lot of people who have been through those systems are doing a lot of work to heal a lot of people, while also trying to maintain a livelihood, right? So harm doesn't remain elsewhere. It comes home, right? Chickens coming, you know. So the other thing, and this comes out of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine, when we think about what it would mean to move away from those harmful systems. So I was talking to my friend Brianna Jones, and she had raised this question about reintegration, to say, folks are very worried about how we're going to reintegrate all these people who are coming out of prison, for instance. Like the reintegration conversation is about them, but the people we actually need to be worried about are the people who were operating as police officers, who, if we defund them, we actually have to do a reintegration project with them. Because think about the skills that they've learned in their job, right? The kind of harmful things that folks, the kinds of logics that people have learned. And that's a kind of unlearning. How do you come back to civil society when your whole job was hurting people, or like, you know, enacting these things? So I think there's a question here about what is going to be our project to reintegrate those folks whose whole lives have been touched by this kind of orientation.
Wow, that's an excellent point. All of these points, I'm just kind of blown away by them. Let me just reach back out to the folks who are here and pick up on some of these questions. And in the meanwhile, if you all panelists would, you know, kind of also think about what might be some of your own curiosities, in addition to questions like reintegration and stewardship. Beatrice is asking the question about the role of education in overcoming racism, and I would say other forms of oppression. And she's saying, you know, when in most of our countries is shaped in general to maintain the status quo, right? And so it's education but what kinds of education would actually be liberatory, right, and potentially transformative? And then another comment here is that West Papua is also colonized by Indonesia since 1962, right? Because of the New York Agreement signed by the US and the Netherlands and Indonesia. And I think it's actually, yeah, the idea that this agreement is called the New York Agreement when it concerns Papua and Indonesia is not surprising. And so really raises the questions of, you know, the role of the US state and the US military. Javier is also saying that because of our Blackness in Melanesia, we experience racial discrimination all the time. So this Blackness is a consistent theme across these contexts. And it seems that in each place, it gets discussed and described differently, but the theme, it seems to me, is really cross-cutting. Right? So let's, then there's one more question. Wow, there's a lot of questions here in the chat. Sharon from the Philippines saying that there's also the question of the state using the pandemic to further its undemocratic agenda and save neoliberalism, which has reared its ugliest consequences during the pandemic, right? And she says it should also be right on the top of women's global agenda. And it's interesting also, speaking of the Philippines, I think Duterte's government just bought $2 billion worth of arms from the US while the people there are suffering, right? And so looking at that. And then one more, and then we'll kind of look at the chats on the side. Beatrice from Brazil is saying that I felt really touched about the debate on colorism because especially here in Brazil, it's an incredible complex thing. The systemic racism here is so evil and destructive that we have similar cases to George Floyd every 23 minutes. 23 minutes. Police brutality here, especially in Rio de Janeiro, already killed so many innocent Black children, I can't even count. Right? So this conversation is really helpful in having us hear directly from affected people from other locations, this topic of race and state violence that connects to those things happening in the US. And looking over here to this other chat, that was the Q&A chat section. Faiha Abdul Hadi, who is in Palestine and was on the colonization panel last night, writes that George Floyd's heart stopped, but the hearts of millions across the globe are pounding, Black and white screaming, no to racism, no to all forms of discrimination, no to killing, no to violence, no to militarization. And she gave us an amazing poem last night where she talked about the checkpoints. And she said, the heart doesn't care about checkpoints. It moves in where it needs to move. And so I think that's an important point as well. Other questions from folks out there? Right. It's conversation about Papua New Guinea again. Any other questions? Yeah. And while we're waiting for some other questions, if any of the speakers have anything more to add. And I also want to give one example that's about the US war in Vietnam. At a particular moment, there was a time when Black Panther members of the US military made alliances with people in Okinawa, Okinawan people which is also a colonized place, colonized by the Japan, to push up against the US military, right? And of course, these men got kicked out of the military, but they stayed and formed this Black Panther Okinawan People Alliance. So there are always these moments where people who are not supposed to be getting together are getting together and doing the political work that's needed in the moment. And that's also very hopeful. Yeah. Like us, we're not supposed to be together, right, Subha? Okay.
I wanted to respond to the question about education.
Yeah.
I think that's a question that's heavy on my mind. Because it is true that the university, that K through 12 is all set up to get us to like squash our imaginations in many, many ways, and to like fit into capitalism. We're trained very early into capitalist logics and practices through our educational system. And some of the ways where that shows up is where young people are put in a position to see the person sitting next to them as their competition and not as their collaborator or co-conspirator, as I like to say. I know, Margo, you don't like that language.
No,
but
no, I love it.
You're warming up to it. But one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how do we infuse, and this is a very much a popular educating, like a popular education mode of being. How do we infuse all of our education systems with actual embodied practices that are liberatory, right? Because one of the things that I've been thinking about, so, in school, they give you all the reading materials, and the reading materials is to get you to think the right thoughts. But everyone can sit in my classroom and say, I'm not a racist. I think all the right thoughts. I'm very woke. And yet it doesn't change anything in terms of how they move in the world, right? It doesn't actually alter the behavior. So, I would teach. I used to be an actress in my past life, and I would do like theater of the oppressed. And I would say things to them like, what would an anti-racist practice look like? I mean, we can understand this if we study ritual. Ritual can get you to cultivate all types of capacities in yourself. Like if you want to practice modesty, you have a way to do that. Like you can create a practice for that. So how would we practice something that dismantles anti-Blackness? How do we practice moving in the world in an anti-racist way? What are those daily lived practices? Because we practice capitalism every day, right? We're forced to. So like thinking about what those embodied practices look like. And my sense is that many people don't have a sense in their body of what freedom feels like. But once you start to feel that in your body, you get less satisfied with anything less, right? If you have that experience. So how do we multiply those experiences in classrooms, in other educational spaces, around kitchen tables? Because, education happens all over the place. How do we multiply those experiences of freedom in our bodies so that we become we're not satisfied with anything less?
Yeah, totally. I mean, smarter people do not necessarily a world save. And I think that's the lesson of why education for education's sake is whack as fuck. I think coming from the tradition, the folk school movement tradition, right? It's like, even in social justice related, popular education spaces, it's a particularly fun word to throw around, but it's actually a practice, right? And it's rooted in a principle that all of our people are able to understand nuance and contradiction. They live at the intersections of those contradictions all the time. And it's rooted in a belief that actually if they had access to the resources that they need to figure, to implement solutions that they come up with to the problems that they experience every day, they would change their material conditions themselves, right? And so I think for me, it's like, one, if education that's not rooted in the idea that everybody gets it and can get it, is not an educational system that I want to be amplifying or supporting or participating in. And two, that any education that's just for the sake of intellectually stimulating conversation is whack to me too, even if it's this one, right? Like, love y'all. And if it doesn't leave with not only more new knowledge that could only exist if we were, sitting at the kitchen table together via Zoom, having this really incredible conversation with people that I love and trust and really learn from, if I'm not making an embodied commitment to do something different than I would have had this conversation not existed, then we're wasting our time anyway, right? So I think the thing that has sustained Highlander for almost 100 years is that concept that everybody's a teacher and everybody's a learner, point blank, period. And two, that you take that knowledge and you do something with it is what makes us unique in the sort of education justice sphere, the folk school movement sphere. It's not just to make you a good citizen. It's to actually change the trajectory. It's to bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice. And so, again, I think if it's just knowledge for knowledge's sake, we're wasting our time.
And, just
I just respond to the education question as well. I mean,
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's just such an important kind of question because I think it often comes up as a solution, right? Like it's often the thing that people say, like in so many conversations and so many workshops, blah, blah, blah. It's always like, oh, we have to educate people and then suddenly they're not going to be racist or they're not going to be imperialist or they're not going to be misogynist. So, education is it kind of keeps coming up. And I think, absolutely to what Xhercis and Ash were both just saying, that I think the education systems that we currently are looking at around the world are really just, I mean, it's like prison, right? It's just another kind of a relocation of power and hegemony. Because it's not just about the way in which it's done. And I think, Xhercis, you spoke really beautifully to that, this kind of capitalist mode of production of just, producing good, productive workers for corporations. I mean, that's basically what, but it's not just that, it's also about what we're being taught, right? And that's also where the hegemonies are just constantly being reproduced. We're being taught racist histories, we're being taught dominant narratives, we're not being taught pluralist, kind of divergent narratives about our own histories, and so on. And I think, again, and I totally kind of want to second what Ash was saying, I think for me, again, it really comes down to the root of, this question, which I think, again, is a question that someone had raised as a separate question, but I think is connected, is about the neoliberalization of education as a whole that's just been happening, I think, over the last 2 decades, right? This kind of advancing neoliberalization. And I think that, I was saying to Margo a couple of nights ago that I have friends in the US who are working within their campus context to build anti-racist campuses and so on. And for me, I'm just like, but you can't, as long as you're making people pay. That is just not, I mean, one thing I am proud to say about this nation state is that we do have a 70+ year public education system, which is really excellent, and a public healthcare system, thank the goddesses. But I mean, to me, it just, you can't really think about anti-racism as long as education is being commodified and people are being made to pay. And I think you can't think about anti-colonialism, you can't think about anti-racism within that context of making people pay to learn and to attend school, to attend university, and so on. So I think that's really kind of the deeper structure that keeps all of this ticking in the way that it's ticking.
And there's a chat a comment or question in the chat, I think, that pushes this question a little bit too. And the person says, you know, what would an alternative education for first generation learners be? And I assume first generation in higher education.
Or, yeah, I think one is like, what do you mean by first generation? Yeah. but yeah, I mean, I think again, to me, it's like, I believe in self-determination. I believe that as someone who is not a first generation learner, that like, I'm not the expert there. But what I know to be true is if I got a whole bunch of first generation folks together and I asked them like, yo, tell me what you're supposed to be learning right now, I bet they could tell me. And I bet if I was asking them what was keeping them up at night, I bet they would find some commonalities. And I bet if I asked them, hey, y'all, like, what is the like one faithful next step you could take toward the utopian vision for your people and your communities and for yourself, right? Because we don't do this social justice work just because we're selfless and care about everybody else but us. Like, I'm trying to be free in my lifetime too. I do it because I want to be good and I want to live well, right? And I do it because I love all of y'all. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And I think that like, if we brought people together across their differences to have those conversations more often, I mean, literally, it's why Highlander's been around for as long as it's been. It's because people desire building community, practicing liberation, practicing freedom, practicing justice. It's something that doesn't just happen overnight. It's something that doesn't happen just because we flick our fingers. It's something that happens because we are intentional about it. And so I think towards pushing an alternative, it's like actually putting the power in the hands of the people that are the learners and the teachers in the first place. I think that's what does it. It's not just like playing around with different methodologies around Socratic seminar. It's actually saying, hey, you all come sit in a room together until you figure it out. That's the magic and the sauce of Highlander Center, is that we've been bringing people together across difference to figure shit out since 1932, right? It's not rocket science, it's finger painting. And I think that if more people were committed to being, and it goes back to what was said earlier, it's like if people were actually like white men, cis rich men, were actually incentivized to be innovative, even in failure, we would learn something. And I think that we don't get the luxury and the right, I think, quite frankly, to do those sort of experimentations and to be innovative in those ways. But I think there's some really incredible folks that are doing that work. I think Highlander Center is just one of them. There's really incredible work happening in Georgia, bringing immigrant communities together, particularly young people, to do alternative education with each other. And they have graduation ceremonies every year. It's called Freedom University. There's really incredible work happening with the University Sin Fronteras that's bringing people together intergenerationally to do all sorts of incredible work. So I think we're living in a time where lots of alternatives are being played around with. I think the challenge is resourcing them so that they can go to scale.
Yeah, and when we think about in places in Latin America where folks are organizing education around indigenous ideas, where you know, say you can have a whole bunch of lessons about how to love, or like how to be a human, you know, like how to be good to each other, how to communicate well, how to solve problems, right? Like we have an enormous opportunity to teach each other how to do those things. And in my classrooms, when I have students come into my classrooms, the first question I ask them is, if you wasn't thinking about getting a job at the end of it, I wrote that in the chat, what would you want to learn about? And there's a moment where they just look at me confused, you know? And it's that, like, creating an opportunity where you create a cognitive dissonance around this planned trajectory that your whole life needs to be about getting into debt to get a job. Because that's also the irony, right? That there's no free education, at least at the level of university in the US. And then we have to talk about giving people an opportunity to understand how the mechanism of debt is like completely squashes freedom opportunities, right? So giving folks an opportunity to imagine that. And then I have these moments where you can see that, you know, like I create final projects, going back to this thing about practices. I create final projects where I'm like, identify something that is delimiting your life and do research on how to change that thing, usually locally, because that's the other thing that I think is part of a problematic orientation in the education system, is that they train folks in the US to think that they can solve problems elsewhere when they don't actually understand elsewheres. They don't speak other languages. Like, think about, you know, and then they're going to come somewhere else and be like, I have the solution for you. Like, no, you haven't done anything at home and you go solve some, right? So there's these ways in which the education system positions people in the context of the US as kind of exceptional, and like, we're going to go do all these things. And I think there's more opportunity for us to create spaces where people can start to think about lessons that would make for a better humanity.
Yeah, thank you so much. So before we go on, I just want to take a little stretch break in a sense. And Lone has brought their poem or a couple of poems to share with us. So Lone, again, please read slowly, especially poetry, you know, may not be so easy to interpret. So please, and go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jan, and really appreciated this dialogue too around education. And I think a similar thing can be said for art and the cultural work that we do. I think art for art's sake is then just serves the purposes of, you know, really entrenching us in the fundamentalist, white supremacist, capitalist ideas. And so I try my best not to do arts for art's sake, because I don't think that's true, right? So I have two poems, and one is very specific and one is pretty general. And I'll start with the specific one, I think, to speak to what folks have shared around prisons. And I think there's a lot to be said about our society, that we have prisons. And I'm always, you know, as someone who's had loved ones in prisons, who currently have loved ones in prisons, the idea that there are folks on the inside and folks on the outside is something that I want us to pay attention to, right? What's it mean for any of us to be on the inside of a cage or on the inside of walls, and what's it mean for others of us to be outside? And I've been thinking a lot about, especially in this moment of these global uprisings, there's been a really, there's been such a obsession with calling anyone of consciousness an outside agitator. And I would love to pose the question, you know, why the hell not? If we were to have the sort of framing that the inside is so terrible, the inside is so restrictive, it is so harmful, it is so violent, that perhaps everyone on the inside would want to be outside, right? And I think that's true for COVID. I think it's true for prisons. I think it's true for detention centers, and all of the ways that our folks are trapped. So this first poem, the context is that my father was incarcerated for a number of years in a private prison facility outside of Macon, Georgia. And in that facility, it was primarily Southeast Asian folks and folks from Cuba and the Caribbean for, you know, things like drug trafficking and sort of the crimes that are associated with alternative economies. All these things I did. My father went to jail. I put all my things in a box. I cut off my hair and grew a third eye to help be myself a little better. I wrote down all of my dreams, even the sad ones, then especially the happy ones. I made a list of all the things I wanted to see and touch with extra parts of me. I bought books about other people's lives to last me a lifetime. I emptied out pens in the sunlight and let the moon make sense of the waste. I turned green and yellow and purple and blue for a brown girl. I made blue in the bathtub and red. There are things that drain and other things that drain too. I made red in my bed and in my pants. How do I forget what happens there? I buttoned every button and left no thread untied, but still covered barely nothing at all. I cooked for one and I cooked for some more. We eat, we eat, we eat. I drove and I drove and I drove and I drove. Not growing wheels for feet, I had to walk. I sang in English when I was sad, and when I wasn't, the songs everyone can hum. I sang in Vietnamese when I was sad and sad some more. Somewhere deep in my body, this is all I know. I counted every bubble in the stuccoed ceiling, my bed strong and firm where I couldn't be. I turtled my way through the woods, looking. The woods talked back, they sigh. I looked for misery and I found it, and then I looked for joy. I did all of these things, but could not touch the person I love. I saved all these things for the next time I would. And then the second poem is just, I think, in the spirit of imagining what's possible and what's already happening and possible in the world. It's called Please Consider This. A bus driver runs for president. The election is fair because the mothers tending the patties count the ballots. Janitors have been awarded the key to the city. Youth get their own festival in the streets. Cooks pick the news read on TV. Teachers simply focus on teaching. Scientists tell the truth as permission. Day laborers sleep through the night. On the radio, street sweepers admire their favorite museums. You and I enjoy the luxury of not knowing, having no answers, just sometimes. Land and water and bread and air and sun for the people, a home for the deserving everyone. Poetry is free and the rich have paid. We have taken all of their teeth and given them to the poor. I know it doesn't work like that. And how is it supposed to work when the rich work none? Tell me what it is. This is a poem after all. We are trying to get free after all.
This is a moment, I think, for us to just breathe in the words of Lone, the poet, but also the poetry that each of you on this panel has spoken. And so appreciating the words and the feelings behind them. And Lone, if you could give us your poems and we can, share them with our participants as well. So I have one round of questions for each of you. And this is about imagining the future. It's also about strengthening, building solidarities. And it's also about thinking about not just how to become more human, right, but how to become better beings in the most fundamental sense, so that we're not separated as human beings from the natural world, right? And so if you had to think about a specific value or principle that we would need to practice to incorporate into the futures that we're imagining, that we already have in mind, that the ideas are already in the works, right? What are the core principles that you all think that we should really embrace and practice as we move forward? And anyone can start. And please, again, speak slowly.
I think a core principle for me is sustainability. Actually, I'm going to say adaptability and sustainability. Because when I think about the work that I do in transformative justice work, for instance, I see that as really long haul work. That's a lifetime work. That's not, and so how do we do that work in a way that honors that we need to be alive at the end of it, that we need to move with others in a way. I understand that we're always in this rapid response mode where it's like crisis all the time. But I think even within that, trying to find ways that we care for each other so that more of us don't get so burnt out in the building of that new possibility. So that feels like a really core and important aspect for me.
I think for me, you know, when I'm really thinking about what would sustain us, as you're saying, Xhercis, to think about really how we continue to be alive and thrive, and what would sustain us. And, you know, thinking about the fact that I really think that solidarity is what sustains us. It's you all. It's, you know, I need all of you. That's why we're here, right? And I think that if we really think about, you know, how to kind of form solidarities in a way that helps each of us stay alive, I think we have to kind of transcend identity, because I think that, you know, in many of our movements, identity has just become another kind of way in which we've just constructed these borders, which kind of just prevent us from embracing other people, from including other people. And it, you know, so I mean, I guess I'm saying, how can we really organize beyond identity, right? How can we organize our movements that is based on shared politics, shared experiences of injustice, shared histories of, you know, oppression, of colonialism, and so on. But how can we kind of not get into this place of saying, oh, white feminists from the US, or Black feminists, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think it's just really important for us to take stock of what identity has done to all of us, to our movements, really. And I think it's just about saying what kind of can really radically bring us together in a way that is meaningful. And I say that fully as a feminist in the global South, knowing that I really do hear this kind of dismissal of other people. You know, we're not always kind of really thinking about how to embrace other people and other feminists and other feminisms and so on. And I sometimes really think it's almost like post-colonial critique, but gone mad. You know, it's like we've gotten so much into this kind of post-colonial critique that we're just willing to kind of sweep aside entire, you know, kind of decades of thinking that people have done, that work that people have done, and so on. But I think equally, I see it in the queer movement. I see it in a lot of queer communities and circles that we are excluding, we're not including, we're still kind of concerned about being lesbians, or we're still concerned about being whatever, bisexual or trans, or so, and that worries me. And I know that we've, especially as feminists, we've done a lot of excluding, and I know that we continue to do it. Feminist movements have a history of excluding, you know, people, and I think it's you know, we have a history of excluding sex workers, we have a history of excluding trans folks, we have a history of excluding intersex folks. We have a history of excluding people living with HIV, people who are incarcerated, people who use drugs, I mean, so on and so forth. And I think it's really kind of time to think about, like, really critically kind of look at our own practices of movement building and really think beyond identity to what really brings us together and how we can form solidarities that sustain us.
Yeah, I think there's a big, I think in the US in particular, I really just, I wrote it down, post-colonial critique gone mad, because I think it's a really great way to put it. I think, you know, how do we hold the balance of, like, identity matters, right? But what do we want to shape our identity around, right? Like, do I want my identity to be shaped purely around my own ideas, my own sense of the world, my own yearnings and desires? In part, sure. do I also want my identity to be centered around how I treat other people? Am I in solidarity with others? You know, am I doing and making the contributions that are necessary, right, for all of us to be free? And I think that's the sort of, I think that's the fine line that we walk, especially organizing with and for ourselves and with our communities, where there's just there's such a tremendous labor that still needs to be done around just recognizing, right, that our people exist, that our people are out there, but at the same time, how do we not get caught up in that? In that visibility or in that representation, because it's extremely superficial, right? It doesn't build power. It doesn't transform power relations. It doesn't, you know, fundamentally change the arena that we live inside of. And I think there's, you know, there's the sort of right-wing weaponization of identity politics, right? To say like, none of this matters, and you know, all of you are just trying to be very politically correct. And then I think there is the like neoliberal identity reductionism, where we can't seem to do anything with each other unless we agree on everything, unless we look the same, unless we say things the same way. And I think that is a big shortcoming of our social movements that we really have to grapple with. And so that all of that is to say, like, I think that is a conversation that continues to need, you know, we need to continue to have that conversation as to not get trapped in a very reductive place. And so to Margo's question of feminist values, I was also going to say solidarity. I think how we show up for each other, how we show up for ourselves. I think Xhercis earlier said, be generous, right? How do we be generous with ourselves and with each other? As like that would just be a completely opposite practice from the dominant culture, right? How do we give of our time and of ourselves more freely? And how do we also, you know, how do we recognize that? And I think this pandemic moment that we're in has also brought to the surface the level of care work and domestic work that is actually embedded in all of our lives, but is extremely gendered and racialized. And now we're in this moment where it's like, oh, we actually all have to do it, right? And it matters that we all do it. And so let's figure out the best way to do it. And I think that's the other piece of this moment that we're in too, is we are being presented with a lot of opportunities to do meaningful things with other people, right? And how do we really move to take advantage of that?
I think this is such a good question. My brain is on fire from what my comrades have already said. I mean, I think solidarity is a verb, right? It's a doing thing. It's not just a principle. I can't just believe in solidarity, right? And so I think of it, I think practice, right? Practice is actually what I want from a global feminist community. I want us to try some stuff, right? I want us to not fall again into the traps of false dichotomies, right? The this or that. I want us to think about accountability, right? It's like people that show solidarity with me and my people, the people that I choose to be my co-conspirators, because I don't believe in like you can't self-appoint yourself an ally, right? Those people that are accountable to me, we go into it knowing that perfection is not acquirable or required, right? I don't expect someone that's in solidarity with me to get everything right. You won't, you can't. Just like I will not, as a cisgendered, you know, American, like for a person from the United States, get everything right. I won't. But what I can do is be accountable to you and not start tomorrow, like my mistakes, totally erase all that I know I'm supposed to do as someone that's committed to global feminism, right? So no false dichotomies, that like accountability is what's required, not perfection, a commitment to practice, patience, and expectation, right? That we should want what's good for our people right now. And anything less is unacceptable. And we can also hold that some of this stuff takes time. Both of those things can live in contradiction and be true at the same time, right? It doesn't have to be a fight about who's the most rad because I believe that it should happen now and you believe it's going to take a century, right? Yeah, solidarity is a verb. I want us to, I think sometimes we get lost in trying to figure out like what is the biggest impact that we can have in this moment and forget doing the very simple things. Like add me on Facebook, let's just talk, right? Like, I think about my Palestinian sisters that are like, can you just wear keffiyeh? I'm like, I'm gonna get arrested for Palestinian liberation. They're like, can you just wear keffiyeh when you say Black Lives Matter? Chill out, do the simple things. My dad would say don't major in the minor and flunk the major, right? Do the simple things over and over and over again. I would say martyrdom is not sexy, right? And saying you're burnt out when really all you need to do is eat a snack and take a nap. Again, we need both. We need discipline and rigor, and we need people to take care of themselves and each other, right? Martyrdom is not sexy, but sacrifice is necessary for all of us, right? To each according to their need, right? And then I would say this is a moment where I hope, and this is going back to what Subha said earlier, is like, this is a moment, my comrade Maurice Mitchell from the Working Families Party in the United States says this all the time. So this moment is an all hands, no sharp elbows moment, right? Now is a time where we need everybody on deck because capitalism is consistently in crisis. We have an opportunity now that I haven't seen in my lifetime, that my grandmother, who was a maid, would have never expected to see, right? Now is a moment, and if we don't take advantage of it, it's on us what future generations are going to be inheriting because we didn't do our due diligence. And so I think now is a moment where, where I hope you can be like, yeah, I believe Black Lives Matter, and I believe that. I believe that, period, right? And I can be like, you know what? And because you believe that, you're my people. You're my people. I get to choose you and you get to choose me. And I think this is a moment where we actually have to be practicing those things. So I feel excited about building this global feminist movement with you all and continuing to learn about all the different kinds of feminisms that are actually going to be required to build the beloved community that we all wish to see in our lifetime.
I just want to say that two things that come to mind is that during this pandemic, we realized how interdependent we actually are. And so it seems like to continue to build into that interdependence in a way that is about relationships, it is about showing up for the work, that kind of practice. But also in the process, how much joy and laughter there is in doing this kind of work. And I think there is, sometimes when we talk about these things, it's like all doom and gloom, but like, when you say things like martyrdom's not sexy, there's like a playfulness in that. There's like, like an ability for us to joke about things that are hard so that we can continue to show up for the work and show up for each other so that we don't forget to laugh along the way. And that's part of the trust building and the relationship building. So,
yeah, otherwise, what's the point? Right?
What is it, right?
Life is too damn hard as it is, right? Regardless of where you at. I mean, I think sometimes we use the same words, but we mean really different things, right? When I talk about solidarity, I think that's why I like the word solidarity. I'm like, it means as much as whoever says it, right? Like, what is solidarity? Solidarity to me is transformative. It's not transactional.
Yes.
Right? When people think about solidarity, they're like, okay, cool. Like, you use my slogan, I use your slogan, we cool. Like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is avenging the suffering of our ancestors, earning the respect of future generations, and being transformed in the service of the work together, right? Together. And the ways that we do that is, in my cultural experience, is highly relational, right? And not just because it's good in this moment, it's a good transaction, but because like I'm choosing you. It's a love story. Solidarity to me is a love story.
Yes,
I love it.
It's a love story. It's like I'm saying,
now you're
like,
talking my language, Ash.
Doing this, me and Margo talk about romance a lot. Like, and I think it's the best metaphor because everybody wants it. Everybody wants to belong to something, to someone, right? When we look at the numbers in the United States about why white people are joining white nationalist and white supremacist organizations is because, like, literally 99% of the time, the respondents say that they are looking for a place to belong.
Exactly.
They're looking for a place to belong. And we too often concede territory based on our like cliquish tendencies to pick and choose who we think is worthy of relation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being a relative, being a person that you chose. So again, I think solidarity is about transcending transaction, right?
Yes.
It's about actually building transformative relationships that, like, by their very nature are going to be full of joy, because you can't help but be joyful when you belong to somebody, to some people, to some place, to some social movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not in a codependent way, right? I'm not saying that like the feminist movement is where all that harmed you is going to be healed. That's not true. You might need a doctor, right? You might need something else that's tangible that helps you deal with those things. But what it can be is a political home, right? It can feel like the best things about home. And to me, that's what I know that solidarity is happening when I feel that way, when I feel like I belong, when I feel like I'm connected, when I feel like we are transforming not only the material conditions that we live in, but each other, right?
Yes.
We're sharper, we're better for being in relationship with each other. And then everything is different. Everything is possible, right? To me, the multiple lessons of the movement for Black lives can be summed up that we came together across our differences to make the impossible possible. That's literally what we tried to do, is we tried to think about what would be impossible if we kept just staying in our sectors away from each other, because of tactical disagreements, or because, it just didn't make sense because we did different kinds of work, right? Policy people over there, the direct action people over here, the organizing people over there, right? What would happen if we came together across those differences and said, we're gonna make some impossible stuff possible? Well, now you've got a whole country talking about defunding police. You got a whole country again, 500 years later talking about abolition, right? You got a whole country that's actually, starting to be interested in thinking about what global solidarity looks like in practice. To me, like, solidarity is those things. It's that feeling of connectedness beyond just I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And I think that if the feminist movement, the global feminist movements, actually were rooted in a principle around practicing what we preach around building community, choosing each other, that this is an all hands, no sharp elbows moment, then what we would get is a winning global feminism. And God, like, if there's ever a time where we needed this, right now. And so I think, again, it would be easy to be like, yes, that means somebody should make that happen, right? But actually the point is that, again, we didn't have this 4-hour-long conversation for the sake of just being intellectually stimulated.
Right.
We had this conversation so that people would make a commitment to these principles that these amazing, brilliant feminists just shared with you, so that we actually get to the practicing next, right? That you get off this Zoom call and you actually do something to practice social solidarity in a time of physical distance. If anybody could teach a world about how to practice social solidarity during a time of physical distance, it's global feminists who've been having conversations across borders for longer than I've been alive. Now's the moment to do that teaching. Now's the time to show people those practices. I fear that if we don't, we won't win. It's really that simple.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, you all have said a lot. You've inspired us in so many ways, as you can just read your chat comments on the right side of the screen. And Ash, as you said, and I absolutely embrace this wholeheartedly, that solidarity is a love story. Solidarity is a collection of love stories. And I think this is a good time to just kind of switch a little bit, unless anybody has any kind of final comments. We still have to do a couple of things. Gabi would like to say something, and Kinchi in Hong Kong also would like to make some remarks. So, good. Move on to the, okay, great. So Gabi, also just I just want to note this one thing, which is that, and this came up in our session earlier this morning, that is in the colonization, panel, is thinking about the privilege of being English speakers, and how that really came up in our a conversation last night. So just also thinking about that. And Gabi, please, your closing comments.
Thank you, Margo. It was very hard. Sorry, it was very difficult to jump in, but it was a wonderful meeting. Thank you so much to all of you. I learned a lot. I had to think a lot. It was a firework of statements, and solidarity is a love story. It's wonderful to hear this, and I think it's a good idea to go. Feminism and solidarity for me is a love story since today. So I have not really interesting remarks, but I would like to thank. Can I, Margo?
Yes, this is your chance, Gabi, please.
First, Kiu Chi, you have to listen to me. Kiu Chi, thank you so much. You are one of the head and heart of this South-South Forum. And I wonder sometimes if I see you have 10 days of South-South Forums. How do you manage it? Do you eat? Do you sleep? Do you walk? Or do you run from one meeting to another? So I know you since years, and I thank you so much for what you did for us. You are the head, the technical head, and you are also the heart of our organization. Thank you so much. And I thank to your team. Lee Seung, you were the first every morning, and every time we started a new session, you were here and we discussed a little bit together. It was very nice. And also to you, I thank very much for what you did for us. To organize, to look that everybody was here, that everybody has what we needed, and so on. And also the interpreters. I have some pictures. I don't know who is behind, but I'm also very happy that you did this very difficult work. Thank you so much. And all the coordinators from Peace Women across the globe who were here, Sima, she left.
She had to leave.
Sima, Faicha, Karen, Vera, Olin. I think it was good to meet every 2 days and to discuss different issues these 2 days. It was good to see. It was good. Sorry. It was good to see you, and it was good to feel that we have common issues and common issues to discuss and to go ahead with this. Annemarie and Carla of the International Office in Bern, you are here with Mitra. Thank you also so much. You supported us in a very good way, and it is important to link everybody together, to link and to see how we can go. We can have more this kind of exchange, of important and deep exchange. Thank you so much. And you, Margo. Margo, thank you so much. You are the best. You are the best moderator. You are the best DJ. But you you did lead all these South-South forums with love, with comprehension, with humor, with intelligence. This is my Margo. Thank you so much. I love you.
Thank you, and I love you. I've always loved you from the
And
beginning.
all these wonderful participants during 24 hours. We worked 18 hours in this way. And it was each meeting was a very, very high experience for us. I think for everybody. And this is up to you. And I thank you very, very, very much. And I wish you a very good struggle for the next years, for the next time, for the next years. Struggle, yes, I think so. For the question of Margot, I thought that no rest is one of our issue. We cannot rest. We have to struggle. And all what is in what we see now, racism, violence, sexual violence. The world is bad, but we love this world, so we have to find out how to work together with a good and deep feminism and the solidarity as a love work. So this is my English. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Gabi. Thank you. And before I turn over the mic, so to speak, to Kinchi for closing comments, I want to invite Mayu Ohenia from, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I couldn't. Oh, great. Welcome. And I think it would be great to hear some of your reactions. I'm so happy that you were able to stay. And please introduce yourself. Mayu and I met at the first South-South Forum many years ago. So please go ahead, your observations and comments.
I was telling you that my English is very bad, but I will try to do my best. And I am very touched about all the things that I heard today. And at the same time, very happy to see these faces that I feel love for you very much. And thank you to be there and to say the things that you said. And also to Kinchi, who is a little quiet, but she is always present everywhere. And thank you very much, Kinchi. I feel with the words that the fights are alive in some moments, like now in Chiapas, Mexico, where the coronavirus problem, the pandemic problem, is very bad with the people. I felt some down and sad because of the economic crisis is really hard for many people. And it's not the theme of this conference, but also the Indian people feel the same things that the things that you say. And the problem of pandemic is worse with them because they don't have nothing to fight with. And also they don't understand this thing that pandemic is, the word of them is very little. It's the community, and the end of the word is the city, like San Cristobal, you know. So this of the word, the far cities and countries, is something that they don't understand very well because of the education is so limited. So I really feel sometimes that it's impossible to do something. I felt a little discouraged, descorazonada, and listen to you today, it was like not all is lost. We have to do many things, and it seems impossible, but it isn't at the same time. And so I want to say thank you, because I really passed some weeks and days very hard looking people dying. It's terrible, terrible. And they don't know why. And some think that the virus is putting in them because the government and the rich people in Mexico don't want to look them alive. You know, it's the idea that they have. So the life, human life matter. Yes, all the human lives matter. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Kinchi?
Well, first, I'd like to thank Margo, because she started to have to propose tea time for the board members. And that's how we started to come together with the board members every Wednesday evening, my time, and Wednesday morning, Margo's time. And it was only, and then we managed as PWAG to discuss and also to formulate several statements for the ceasefire, for attention to domestic violence. And so you can find these statements on the PWAG website. And then on May the 27th, we were chatting, and then I said that we will decide, we will be having the South-South Forum. So wouldn't it be good if we reserve 2 full days for the PWAG to organize 6 sessions on feminist perspectives? And so it's only been 6 weeks before that we conceived these 2 days workshops. But then I feel that it's been really fantastic to have all the speakers to come together. And we had the 1,000 women in 2005, and the whole idea was to make the work visible. But well, there have been a lot of difficulties. We had also some achievements, but I feel that now with the current with the current mode, we could be doing much more, connecting the 1,000 peace women, connecting the millions of women around who are doing such important work for peace. So, and so I would really like to thank Margo, thank Gabi, thank the board members and the secretariat for supporting this event and making it possible. I would really love to thank our interpreters because we started the forum, the South-South Forum, on the 8th, and this is already the 8th day that we are having the forum. So except for one day when we had a concert, for all these previous 7 days, they had been interpreting 9 hours, for the full 9 hours. And for some of us as listeners, we can sit back, we can take a cup of tea, but they can't. They had to be very focused on every word that's being said and trying to communicate it. So it's a lot of energy, but then they have been doing it so gracefully. And so I would love to thank you, the interpreters, and we will be seeing them for 2 more days. They will still be here for tomorrow and for the day after. And so that's our lovely interpreters who have been doing the interpreting for the South-South Forum for quite a number of years. And so when you see on the screen the person who's also talking at the same time, then you know it's them. Then for the team, actually, I'm not the one doing so much work. It's the team members who have been taking up a lot of work. So we have actually 15 members in our team. Quite a number of them are volunteers. And so they have been working actually not only for the 9 hours every day for the workshops, because we have to come in 1 hour before to set up things, and then we have to, after the session ends, then we have to download the files, etc., and it takes another hour. So actually it means 15 full hours every day. But then that means subtracting it, subtracting the 24 minus 15, then we still have some more hours for sleep, for a shower. And actually quite a number of us went for a swim in the swimming pool last night for half an hour. So, but I'm sorry to say, because of the pandemic coming back, the virus coming back, so we are having all the closing downs of all the sports facilities and everything. So this team, then I haven't heard one word of complaint that it's too much work, it's too tiring. And I'm truly grateful to this team we have been working with each other for all these years. And it's been a very gratifying experience when you have a group of people working together and supporting each other. And so while we are having these on the Zoom, the web Zoom webinars, we are also doing for some lectures, we are also doing that live streaming in China. So we had Professor Dai Jinghua's lecture on the 9th in China, and we had 30,000 in the audience. And then for the concert, we had 12,000 in the audience. So some of you came in for the concert on the 13th. And so we will still be having all these e-lectures and concerts, and also for the workshop tomorrow on Venezuela, that will also be live streamed by Alba. So we are hoping that for some of these work, then we could reach a wider audience and to be involving more people in this solidarity network. So, all this time we have been already editing the videos. So some of them are already put up on the Global University website. We are also putting subtitles to some of the videos, and some of that is already being done. So that's also some of the part of the work from the team. And so lastly, we have been able to meet so many of you, and sometimes we hear you only for 15 minutes or for 5 minutes, but I feel that this is only one of the meetings, encounters that we are having. So we have already had received requests for extended seminars, extended lectures, extended sessions. So I think the PWAG could be also thinking along with all the our sister organizations and networks for series of seminars or things, so that we can go deep okay, and I was very impressed that when Ashley just now, she said that you see all these alliances, they are wide, but they are not deep. And I think to go deep, it is most important so that we can be effective. And the last remark is that we talked a lot about love, and I think that is the main driving force for us to go on, but it's also necessary to sustain hope. And so with love and with hope, then I'm sure we can continue to build this movement for sustainability, and we ourselves can be sustainable too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kiu Chi. And You know, Xhercis kind of teased me earlier about conspiracy, and I've come to learn that the word conspire actually means in Latin to breathe together. And what if we feminists, the peoples of the world who are on this side of things, actually breathe together? What force we could create, and we could release our generativity, our creativity. So I'm embracing the word conspire from here on out as all of us breathing together.